Hello and welcome to notes number 7 with Miss S. In these sets of notes we're going to be talking mostly about homeostasis in the body, which basically means that the body is able to maintain a constant temperature, a constant acidity level. Everything is A-OK in the body. So we're going to look specifically at the cell membrane, which is what surrounds every single cell, and how things moving into and out of the cell allows the body to stay the same. So homeostasis is this really important term that you're going to see all over the place. Homeo or homo means the same, and stasis means to stay still or stable. So this literally means to stay the same or to stay stable in the body. So a fancy term or a way of defining homeostasis is maintaining a stable internal environment, meaning the inside of your body, despite, even though things are changing externally, outside of the environment. So say you walk outside and it's snowing outside, you still have an internal temperature of 98 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm sorry. So your temperature has to stay the same. When you don't, you have a fever, and really bad things can happen if your temperature gets too high. Your chemical balance needs to stay the same, which is your pH level. Your water balance needs to stay stable, because if not, you become too dehydrated, or you can actually drink too much water and kind of drown your cells. And how this is determined in the body and how homeostasis works is a system called negative feedback. Basically what this is how your thermostat in your house works. Okay, so say you like your temperature at 70 degrees. Okay, you're going to set the thermostat for 70 degrees. Okay, now if it goes below that, there's going to be a signal sent to turn on the heater, and heat is going to be produced, and therefore the temperature of the room is going to increase until it reaches 70 degrees. Once it reaches 70 degrees, it's going to shut off the heater. Okay? So this is exactly how our body works. Our body condition changes, say our temperature. Our body has to respond to that change to return back to the normal temperature. So this is the same exact example of the heating, but in a different way. Okay, so this can be called negative feedback, or it can be called feedback inhibition. Okay. Now the body as a whole is maintaining homeostasis, but that has to happen at different levels. Okay, we know that our body is composed of trillions of cells. We have muscle cells, we have nerve cells, we have blood cells, we have all these different types of cells that have different jobs and that are helping to keep our body stable. Now when these cells are grouped together, say we just have one muscle cell, but if we group a muscle cell and a muscle cell and a muscle cell and a muscle cell, we're going to get what is called tissues. Okay, so we have muscle tissue, we have bone, we have nervous tissue. So it's not just one single cell, but it's a group of cells that work together. Now if I get a group of these tissues and I combine them with more groups of tissues and more groups of tissues and more cells and more cells and more cells, eventually I'm going to form organs, right? I'm going to form the liver, the heart, the lungs, the pancreas, a specific muscle. I might make the bicep muscle in my arm. Okay, so this is basically going from the smallest level to the largest level. A single cell, a group of cells is called the tissue, and a group of tissues is going to make an organ. Here we have showing even from a smaller level. An atom is the smallest, then combining different atoms together makes a molecule, then combining molecules together makes a big molecule, a macromolecule, then that makes up an organelle. It makes up part of what's inside of a cell. Those things, make up a cell. So a group of cells makes a tissue. A group of tissues makes an organ. A group of organs, like the liver, the stomach, the large intestine, the small intestine make up an organ system. Like the digestive system helps us break down food. And all of the organ systems together in our body make up the organism, make up the person. Okay, so we have to have organs working together in our systems. So for example, we have the circulatory system, we have the digestive system, respiratory is how we breathe, reproductive system is how we reproduce and have children, endocrine system, excretory system, nervous system, musculoskeletal, and go on and on. Depends on who or what textbook you're looking at to see how many systems you have. Generally we have 11, but depending on how you break those apart, there can be more or less. Okay, but what's important is that the digestive system is not just the stomach working alone. You have to have the mouth to chew the food, then the esophagus to bring down the food into the stomach. So it's a bunch of different organs working together. So these 11 systems all together are going to allow your body to maintain homeostasis. So this term is really broad because you can talk about homeostasis at the very smallest level. You can talk about the cell, or you can talk about the body as a whole. Okay, here are the 11 different systems that we just briefly mentioned earlier. So we're going to focus at the cellular level. Okay, so we're going to be looking at plasma membranes. Plasma membranes are the same exact thing as cell membranes. Cell membranes are what surround a cell. So every single cell has this kind of coat. Okay, and why it is really important is because it surrounds it, it controls what is going to enter the cell and what is going to exit the cell. So it's going to be able to maintain homeostasis. I like to think of it as the bouncer of a club. The bouncer of a club says, oh, you're pretty, you can come on into my club, or you're not so hot, you're not coming in. That's exactly what the cell membrane does. It's the bouncer of the cell. It says, yes, water, you can come on in. No, water, you can't come on in. It's going to control how much water you have in your body and everything else. It also provides protection and support for the cell. So you can think of it as the bouncer of a club for that reason too. The bouncer makes sure that no one is getting too rowdy and throws out anyone who is. The cell membrane does the same exact thing. It supports the cell. Now, if you looked up close at the cell membrane, just that little line that we drew, you would see that the cell membrane looks a little bit more complicated. It is made of what is called a phospholipid bilayer. Okay? Phospholipids refer to this structure right here. It has a head and it has these two tails. This is considered a phospholipid. Remember, lipids are types of fats. And the reason why it's called a bilayer is bi means two. It has a layer of these heads and tails facing this way, and upside down it has a layer of heads and tails facing this way. So in the previous picture you just saw it, the cell membrane as a line around the cell. If you were to zoom into that line, this is what you would see. Now it's really important that it's made up of phospholipids because basically its structure is what makes it able to allow certain things in and out. The head of the phospholipid is considered polar or water-loving. The way I remember that is polar bears love the water. And these tails are non-polar. They hate the water. They fear the water. That's why the tails are basically inside here and the heads are on the outside and inside of the cell. So that's why they face each other like this. Okay. Now you can also see that that's not the only thing in the cell membrane. You can see these things right here. These are different types of proteins, and there are also pieces of cholesterol in there. Okay. So just to remember those terms, polar, think polar bears. Polar bears love the water, so those phosphate heads love the water, and the fatty acid tails are nonpolar. They hate the water because fat hates water. Fat and water do not mix. If you were to put oil on top in a glass of water, it would go on the top. It does not mix. Okay, so here we have the picture that we just saw, but in a bigger form. We have proteins being showed here. This is a transport protein, and here we have our phospholipids, our two layers, and here we have our carbohydrate chains. Okay. So cell membranes have pores or holes. Okay. Now what this allows is if something has holes, it's going to allow things to get through, but only some things. Okay. It's called selectively permeable. If you're selective, it means you're very picky, right? If I'm selective in choosing a mate, it might mean, I don't like men who have blonde hair, only like people who have brown hair. So I'm only going to date people who have brown hair. And the cell membrane is exactly like that. It's going to allow some molecules in, and it's going to keep others out. And this structure, all of these different things that make it up, allow it to be selective. Okay? So if you were to look really closely between all of these little phospholipids, there's tiny little spaces. There's tiny little holes or pores. And what that does is it lets small little things be able to get through and get into the cell. Okay? But large things are not going to be able to squeeze through these little holes. If a large thing wants to get in and the cell wants it to get in, it's going to have to use these pores, these transport proteins. So there's tiny little pores right here, but there's also holes or pores in certain transport proteins. Again, the bouncer of the club. What that means is that things are going to be allowed in and out of the cell membrane, but in different ways. Passive transport, a way of getting into the cell membrane called passive transport, requires no energy at all. Think about if you're very passive in a relationship. It means you don't really speak up for yourself. You don't really do anything in the relationship. You're just there. And we're going to be talking about 3 different types of passive transport called diffusion, facilitative diffusion, and osmosis. So I like to think of this as going down a hill. Okay, it takes no work at all. You're having fun. You're going from high to low. Active transport is the opposite. Active means you're using energy. We're going to be talking about protein pumps, endocytosis, and exocytosis. This requires work, so it's like you're going back up the hill in rollerblades. So the 3 types of passive transport are diffusion, facilitated diffusion, which is just diffusion with the help of transport proteins. Facilitate means to help. And osmosis, which is the diffusion of water. We're going to talk about each of these very quickly. So the first is diffusion. Diffusion I like to think of as farts, okay? If you're going to fart, right, I know this sounds funny, but out of your butt is going to come a lot of fart molecules, like this illustration right here. This would be your butt. And the person sitting right next to you might smell your fart, and the person all the way in the back of the room might not smell your fart right away. So what diffusion means is that molecules are going to travel from where there is a lot to where there is a little bit. It's going to spread out till it is all relatively equal, so everyone in the room can smell your fart. So diffusion is when molecules travel from where there is a lot to where there's a little. We call that high to low. Think of the hill example. You're going from high to low. It requires no energy at all. It's what things naturally do. So in our cell membrane, things can naturally go from where there is a lot to where there is a little. Like small things like oxygen and carbon dioxide. If there is a cell and there's a lot of oxygen on the outside and a little bit inside, the oxygen is going to go from where there's a lot to where there's a little bit. Okay, until they're all spread out, till they're equal. Okay, so here's another example. They want to be equal, so they're going to go from high to low. Now, facilitated diffusion is the same exact thing, but all it means is that instead of just going through the cell membrane like this picture here, it's going to be going through one of these proteins. Okay, these are those purple proteins that you saw earlier. They're just represented in a different way. So this is regular diffusion right here. Things going from where there's a lot to where there's a little. And this is facilitative diffusion. They're going from a lot to a little, but they're going through this transport protein. Okay? So they're very specific. They're not just going to allow anything to go through here. They're specific in what they choose. But what this allows is this allows larger and charged molecules to go through. So for example, glucose and different ions that are needed in our body because it's a larger hole or a larger pore. Okay. Now osmosis is again the same exact thing, from high to low, except that osmosis is only talking about water. The way I remember that osmosis is the diffusion of water is I picture this O in osmosis as a raindrop, as a drop of water. Okay, so if these are water molecules here, notice how there's an equal amount here and there's an equal amount here, but they may have not started that way. Active transport is the exact opposite. Active requires energy. This is the example of going up the hill in rollerblades. Okay, so it's going to move things where they are needed. It doesn't happen naturally. So it's the opposite. It's going to make things go from low to high. It would be like if all the farts spread out in the room, say the farter is here and this is the room, it would be like all of a sudden the fart molecule is being blown back into the face of the farter. It would take a fan to do that. A fan requires electricity, requires energy. So we're going to be talking about 3 types of active transport: protein pumps, endocytosis, and exocytosis. Protein pumps look very similar to transport proteins, except they're going to be changing shape in order to move things to the other side. So when things are changing shape, they require energy. Okay, so they're pumping things from where there is a little bit to where there is a lot. Okay, so this red one, there's just one red one here and a lot of red ones here. So this would be pumped to where there is a lot. Naturally, things don't want to go that way. Okay, now the other types of active transport are endocytosis. Okay, endo means in. So this is when things are taken into a cell. So here we have an example of endocytosis. We have a cell and we have some molecule here that we want inside of the cell. So it's going to wrap itself around and take in that molecule. This is what happens with our white blood cells. Our white blood cells see a disease or see a germ, and they're going to literally take in the germ and then destroy it. Okay, so this is going to be using energy because our cell membrane is folding around the food particle or the germ or whatever it is. So endocytosis is commonly called cell eating because it digests or breaks down whatever it took in. The other type is exocytosis. Exo means exit or out. Okay, so exo, I want you to think exit, going out. This is the exact opposite. It's when we want to release these particles out of the cell instead of taking them in. So our cell membrane is going to fuse with the outside of the cell and be forced out. Again, this is requiring energy. This is commonly how our wastes and hormones are removed from our cells.